When my fiancé's family spoke in Arabic at our engagement dinner, assuming I couldn't understand a word, they revealed a conspiracy that had been carefully constructed around me for 3 years. What I overheard that night about my inheritance and their plans for my future destroyed everything I thought I knew about love and trust. 6 months later, standing in the lobby of a law firm I never knew existed, holding documents that proved my late father had anticipated this exact betrayal, I realized that sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the greatest gift of all, the element of surprise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The marble floors of Patterson & Chun Legal Associates reflected the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, creating patterns that shifted as clouds moved across the Seattle skyline. I stood there holding a leather portfolio that had arrived at my apartment 3 days earlier with no return address, just my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting across the front. Inside were documents that explained why the past 6 months had unfolded exactly as they had, why every loss and humiliation had been orchestrated, and why my father had spent the final year of his life building a legal fortress around assets I never knew existed. The portfolio contained evidence of fraud that stretched back to before I had even met Marcus Khalil, the man I had agreed to marry. It contained financial records that showed how his family had been monitoring my father's business dealings for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to position themselves as trusted allies while actually planning systematic theft. It contained recordings my father had made during business meetings where Marcus's uncle Rashid had made promises he never intended to keep, where Marcus's mother Amira had pretended concern for my father's health while actually gathering information about his estate planning, where Marcus himself had reported back to his family about details I had shared with him in private moments when I thought I was confiding in someone who loved me. My father, David Chun, had been many things during his 63 years. A brilliant software engineer who had built and sold 2 successful companies, a widower who had raised me alone after my mother died when I was 8, a man who spoke 5 languages fluently and understood that business in international markets required cultural intelligence as much as technical expertise, and apparently, during his final year, a strategic planner who had anticipated that the Khalil family would not honor their business agreements and had quietly documented everything necessary to protect me from their schemes. Standing in that law office lobby, I could feel my phone vibrating in my purse with what were probably more messages from Marcus. He had been calling and texting constantly for the past 72 hours, ever since I had moved out of our shared apartment without explanation, taking only my personal belongings and leaving behind the engagement ring he had given me on a yacht in the San Juan Islands 8 months earlier. The ring had cost $40,000 according to Marcus, though I later discovered it had actually cost $12,000 and he had pocketed the difference from money that was supposed to be used for wedding expenses that my father had contributed before his death. Marcus thought I had left because I was overwhelmed by grief or wedding planning stress, or perhaps because I had discovered his affair with his former colleague Yasmin, which he had been conducting with the kind of carelessness that suggested he did not actually fear being caught. He had no idea that I understood every word his family had spoken in Arabic during our engagement dinner 6 months ago. He had no idea that I had spent the months since that dinner quietly gathering additional evidence, documenting conversations, copying files from his laptop when he left it unlocked, and preparing for this exact moment when I would stop being the naive daughter of a dead man whose estate could be plundered and would instead become something his family had not anticipated, an adversary with resources and knowledge they had assumed would remain hidden forever. The receptionist at Patterson & Chun glanced up from her computer screen with a professional smile that suggested she had been expecting me. She was in her early 40s with silver streaking through her black hair, and wearing a burgundy suit that looked expensive without being ostentatious. Her desk was immaculate, organized with the kind of precision that suggested she took pride in her work and did not tolerate inefficiency. "Miss Chun," she said, and her use of my name without requiring me to introduce myself confirmed that my arrival had been anticipated and prepared for. "Mr. Patterson is ready for you. Please follow me." We walked through hallways decorated with understated artwork, and past offices where attorneys worked behind glass walls that provided transparency without sacrificing focus. Everything about the space communicated competence and discretion, exactly the qualities my father would have valued when selecting legal representation. The receptionist stopped at a corner office with a view that stretched from downtown Seattle to Elliott Bay, knocked once on the open door, and gestured for me to enter. James Patterson stood from behind a desk that held neat stacks of documents organized with colored tabs. He was perhaps 60 years old with gray hair and sharp eyes behind rimless glasses, wearing a navy suit that had been tailored precisely to his frame. He extended his hand across the desk and his handshake was firm without being aggressive, professional without being cold. "Ms. Chun," he said, and I appreciated that he did not offer false condolences about my father or make small talk designed to ease tension. "Thank you for coming. I know the past few months have been extraordinarily difficult, and I want you to know that everything your father put in place was designed to ensure you would have options and resources when you needed them most. Please sit down and I will explain what he arranged and what your choices are moving forward." I sat in a leather chair that was comfortable without being plush, designed for extended conversations rather than brief meetings. Through the window behind Mr. Patterson, I could see ferries crossing the bay and remember how my father had loved watching them, how he used to say that successful navigation required understanding currents and planning for obstacles rather than simply pointing toward a destination and hoping for the best. "Before we begin," Mr. Patterson said, pulling out a file labeled with my name and a reference number I did not recognize, "I want to confirm that you received the portfolio I sent to your apartment and that you have reviewed its contents. Have you had time to examine everything your father left for you?" I nodded, placing the leather portfolio on his desk. "I have read every document and listened to every recording. I understand that Marcus Khalil and his family have been planning to defraud me since before my father died, that they positioned Marcus in my life deliberately to gain access to information about my father's business assets and estate planning, and that my father discovered their intentions approximately 14 months before his death, and spent that time documenting their activities and protecting assets they believed they would be able to access through manipulation or legal challenges. After he was gone, Mr. Patterson's expression showed approval mixed with sympathy. "Your father was an exceptional strategist. When he came to me 18 months ago, he explained that the Khalil family had approached him about a business partnership that seemed too favorable to their interests and too careless about proper due diligence. He began investigating their background and discovered a pattern of similar arrangements with other families, always targeting recent widowers or individuals who had lost spouses and might be vulnerable to cultivation of new relationships. He realized they had likely identified you as a target, and that Marcus's interest in you was probably not coincidental. The confirmation of what I had already concluded from reading the documents still felt like a physical blow. I had suspected as much after overhearing the conversation at the engagement dinner, but hearing it stated plainly by my father's attorney made it undeniably real in a way that left no room for alternative explanations or hopeful reinterpretations. 6 months ago, I had believed I was living a fortunate life that was unfolding exactly as it should. I was 28 years old, working as a project manager for a sustainable architecture firm in Seattle, engaged to a man I thought loved me, planning a wedding that would blend my Chinese-American heritage with Marcus's Lebanese-American background, and believing that my father's death from pancreatic cancer 14 months earlier had been the worst tragedy I would face in my 20s. I had been wrong about nearly everything except the tragedy of losing my father, which turned out to be even more complex than I had understood at the time. My father had died knowing that the man I planned to marry was using me to access assets worth millions, knowing that Marcus's family had targeted me deliberately, knowing that my grief and loneliness after losing my only parent had made me vulnerable to someone who presented himself as supportive and trustworthy. My father had died unable to tell me the truth directly because he understood that I would not have believed him, that I would have thought his suspicions were paranoia brought on by terminal illness, that I would have defended Marcus and potentially destroyed my relationship with my father in his final months. So instead, he had built a legal case and financial structure that would protect me even after his death, trusting that eventually I would discover the truth and would need resources to defend myself. The engagement dinner had been held at the Khalil family home in Bellevue, an expansive house in a gated community where Mercedes and BMW vehicles filled the circular driveway, and where every detail of the interior decoration communicated wealth without taste, expense without elegance. Marcus's mother Amira had insisted on hosting the dinner, rather than having it at a restaurant, saying that family celebrations should happen in family spaces where everyone could relax and be themselves. I had appreciated the gesture at the time, interpreting it as acceptance and warmth, rather than understanding that it was strategic staging for conversations they wanted to have without witnesses outside the family. The dinner itself had been elaborate, featuring dishes that Amira had spent 2 days preparing according to Marcus. Lamb cooked with 7 spices, rice pilaf with toasted almonds and raisins, faddish salad, hummus made from dried chickpeas that had been soaked overnight, and baklava constructed with layers so delicate they dissolved on the tongue. Marcus's extended family had attended, including his uncle Rashid, who had been my father's business partner in what was supposed to be a joint venture developing property management software. His aunt Nadia, who always complimented my appearance in ways that felt slightly critical, his 2 younger sisters who giggled together in corners, and various cousins who regarded me with expressions I could not quite interpret, but which I tried to read as friendly curiosity rather than assessment. The evening had unfolded with what seemed like genuine celebration. Amira had toasted to our happiness and to the blending of families, saying that love transcends cultural differences and creates new traditions that honor both backgrounds. Rashid had made jokes about Marcus finally settling down, and about how marriage would mature him in ways that bachelorhood never could. Marcus's sisters had asked about wedding plans and offered to help with decorations or music selection. The younger cousins had wanted to know if we would have children soon and what we would name them, suggesting various family names that carried significance in their tradition. I had felt welcomed, embraced, included in a large family system that contrasted sharply with the quiet household I had grown up in as an only child with a single parent. I had felt grateful for what seemed like unconditional acceptance, never suspecting that every gesture of warmth was calculated performance designed to ensure I would not question their intentions or examine their actions too closely. The critical moment had come late in the evening, after dinner had been cleared and dessert had been served, after I had consumed enough wine that I felt relaxed and slightly sleepy, after the younger cousins had been sent to watch television in the basement and the gathering had contracted to include only the adults. I had excused myself to use the restroom, walking down a hallway lined with family photographs that showed generations of Khalil family members at weddings and graduations and holiday celebrations. When I returned toward the dining room, I heard conversation in Arabic coming from the partially open door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had stopped in the hallway, not because I intended to eavesdrop, but because I heard my name spoken in a tone that made my instincts flare with warning. I stood there in the dim hallway, my hand on the wall, listening to Marcus's family discuss me in a language they assumed I could not understand, revealing plans they assumed would remain secret until it was too late for me to defend myself. My father had taught me Arabic starting when I was 10 years old, saying that language skills would serve me well in business, and that understanding how people communicate in their native tongues provides insight into how they think and what they value. He had hired tutors who worked with me through middle school and high school, and I had continued studying through college, eventually becoming fluent enough to read Arabic newspapers and conduct business conversations without hesitation. But I had never mentioned this skill to Marcus, not out of deliberate concealment but simply because it had never come up naturally in our conversations, and he had never asked about my language abilities beyond noting that I spoke English and Mandarin. Marcus's family had made the same assumption that many people make when they see someone who does not phenotypically match their expectations about who speaks which languages. They assumed that my Chinese heritage meant I could not possibly understand Arabic, and they had conducted their entire conspiracy in a language they believed provided absolute privacy from my comprehension. What I heard in those 10 minutes standing in the hallway destroyed every assumption I had made about my relationship with Marcus and about the past 3 years of my life. Rashid's voice, authoritative and satisfied, explaining that the estate settlement was proceeding exactly as planned, and that once the marriage was finalized, they would have access to assets that David Chun had been trying to protect through complicated trust structures. Amira's voice, practical and calculating, discussing how to ensure I remained isolated from my father's former business associates, who might raise questions about financial arrangements. Nadia's voice, dismissive and contemptuous, saying that I was exactly the kind of naive American girl who would never suspect that genuine affection could be simulated for strategic purposes. And Marcus's voice, casual and detached, reporting that I had signed documents he had presented as routine estate paperwork but which actually granted him power of attorney over certain accounts, that I had shared information about my father's intellectual property holdings without understanding their value, and that I continued to trust him completely despite small inconsistencies that a more suspicious person might have questioned. His tone when speaking about me held no affection, no guilt, no conflict about the deception he was perpetrating. I was discussed the way someone might discuss a particularly cooperative business partner, who was useful but not worthy of genuine respect or consideration. The conversation had continued with planning about timeline and logistics, about ensuring the wedding happened before I had opportunity to consult with independent attorneys or financial advisors, about managing my grief and isolation to keep me dependent on Marcus for emotional support and practical guidance, about what would happen to assets once they had legal access, and how they would structure things to minimize my ability to challenge their control even if I eventually realized I had been defrauded. I had stood in that hallway feeling my entire reality fracture and reform into something unrecognizable. The man I had agreed to marry had never loved me and had been assigned to cultivate a relationship with me as part of a family business strategy. The grief I had shared with him about losing my father had been tactical information he reported back to his family. The wedding we were planning was not a celebration but a mechanism for legal theft. Every intimate moment we had shared had been performance on his part. Every vulnerability I had revealed had been intelligence he collected. Every decision we made together had been designed to advance his family's agenda, rather than to build our shared future. I had wanted to walk back into that dining room and confront them immediately, to throw their conspiracy back in their faces, and watch them scramble to deny what I had heard. But some instinct I did not know I possessed had stopped me. Instead, I had flushed the toilet in the nearby bathroom to provide audible evidence of my location, waited 30 seconds, and then returned to the dining room with a smile fixed on my face that felt like it might crack my jaw. The conversation had immediately switched back to English when I appeared in the doorway. Amira had asked if I wanted more tea. Rashid had complimented my dress. Marcus had pulled out my chair and kissed my temple in a gesture that would have seemed affectionate if I had not just heard him describe me as a useful idiot who could be easily manipulated. I had sat down and participated in the remainder of the evening with what I hoped was convincing normalcy, laughing at jokes and answering questions and pretending that I had not just discovered that my entire life was built on elaborate lies. The drive home that night had been quiet. Marcus had attributed my silence to tiredness from the long evening and the rich food. He had held my hand while driving and talked about how well the dinner had gone, how much his family liked me, how beautiful our wedding would be, how happy our life together would become. Every word had felt like glass scraping against my skin, painful in ways I could not reveal without explaining why I was hurt, which would have exposed that I understood Arabic and thereby eliminated the only advantage I currently possessed. I had spent that night lying awake next to Marcus in our shared bed, feeling the warmth of his body next to mine and understanding that proximity to another person does not require genuine intimacy, that someone can sleep beside you every night while remaining a complete stranger, that trust is a gift that can be weaponized against the person who offers it. I had begun planning my response that night, lying in the darkness, listening to Marcus breathe in the steady rhythm of someone who sleeps without guilt or anxiety, whose conscience is not troubled by the harm he inflicts on others. Now, 6 months later, sitting in James Patterson's office with my father's carefully assembled evidence spread before us, I was ready to stop pretending and start fighting back. Mr. Patterson opened the primary file and pulled out a document that had been marked with red tabs indicating priority attention. Your father established 3 separate trusts before his death, he explained, and he restructured his estate in ways that make it extremely difficult for anyone to challenge the distribution he intended. The Khalil family believes they have legal standing to contest certain elements of the estate, based on business partnerships and verbal agreements they claim your father made. They are incorrect and we have documentation that proves they are incorrect, but they do not know we have this documentation and they are proceeding as if their legal position is strong. He handed me a summary sheet that outlined the trust structures in language designed for non-attorney comprehension. The 3 trusts contain different asset categories. One held real estate properties in Seattle and Bellevue that my father had purchased over 2 decades, currently valued at approximately $8 million. Another held intellectual property rights from the software companies my father had built and sold, structured to provide ongoing royalty income that averaged $400,000 annually. The third held liquid assets including stocks, bonds, and cash equivalents totaling approximately $6 million. The total value exceeded $14 million, significantly more than I had understood my father's estate to contain. Marcus and his family had apparently done their research and had targeted me precisely because they understood the scope of what they hoped to access through marriage and legal manipulation. Your father also left detailed instructions about how he wanted you to handle the situation with the Khalil family, Mr. Patterson continued, pulling out a letter written in my father's handwriting on plain paper without any legal letterhead. He wanted you to know that he understood what you were going through, and that none of this was your fault. He wanted you to know that intelligent people can be deceived by skilled manipulators, and that being trusting does not make you foolish. And he wanted you to know that you have choices about how to proceed. I took the letter from Mr. Patterson's hand and recognized my father's distinctive handwriting immediately, the precise formation of letters that came from his engineering training, the consistent spacing that reflected his methodical mind. Reading words he had written during his final months, knowing he had been aware of my deception while I remained oblivious, brought grief crashing back with force I had not anticipated. My eyes burned, but I did not allow myself to cry in this professional setting. I would read the full letter later in private. For now I needed to understand my options. What choices did my father give me? I asked, keeping my voice steady through effort of will. Mr. Patterson's expression showed respect for my composure. You can settle quietly by agreeing to pay the Khalil family a specified amount in exchange for their agreement not to pursue litigation and not to contact you again. This would end things quickly and allow you to move forward with minimal public exposure. The amount your father suggested for this option was $250,000, enough to make them feel they gained something while representing less than 2% of the actual estate value, which they do not fully understand. He paused before continuing to the second option. Or you can fight them through legal proceedings by using the evidence your father collected to demonstrate their fraud and bad faith. This would likely result in complete victory because the documentation is thorough and damning, but it would require approximately 18 months of litigation, and would involve some public attention because business fraud cases of this magnitude sometimes attract media coverage. You would almost certainly win and they would gain nothing, but the process would be difficult and would require you to testify about personal details of your relationship with Marcus that might be painful to discuss in legal proceedings. I thought about Marcus calling my phone repeatedly, desperate to understand why I had left, convinced that he could manipulate me back into compliance if he could just speak to me directly. I thought about his mother Amira preparing elaborate meals while planning how to steal from me. I thought about Rashid pretending to honor his business partnership with my father while actively conspiring to defraud his estate. I thought about all of them sitting around that dinner table speaking in Arabic about me, as if I were an object to be acquired rather than a person worthy of respect or honesty. The choice felt obvious. I want to fight, I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected. Clear and firm with certainty I had not felt since before my father's diagnosis, when I still believed the world operated according to principles of fairness and basic human decency. I want them to face legal consequences for what they planned. I want a judge to see the evidence and rule on the record that what they did was fraud. I want Marcus to understand that I was never the naive fool he believed me to be. And I want anyone else they might target in the future to be able to find public documentation of their schemes and protect themselves accordingly. Mr. Patterson nodded as if my response was exactly what he had expected and perhaps hoped for. Then we will proceed with litigation. I should warn you that this will not be easy. The Khalil family will hire aggressive attorneys who will try to discredit you, who will claim that you misunderstood innocent conversations, or that you fabricated evidence out of spite about a failed relationship. They will try to make this about a bitter ex-fiancé seeking revenge rather than about systematic fraud. You will need to be prepared for them to attack your character and your credibility. I thought about the 6 months I had spent pretending ignorance while quietly copying files and recording conversations and documenting every inconsistency between what Marcus told me and what I could verify independently. I thought about the discipline it had required to share a bed with someone I knew was betraying me, while maintaining a facade of trust and affection. I thought about my father facing terminal illness while building legal fortifications to protect me from dangers I did not yet recognize. If he could do that while dying, I could certainly handle whatever attacks Marcus's attorneys wanted to deploy. I am prepared, I said. When do we begin? 3 years earlier, before I had ever heard the name Marcus Khalil, my life had possessed the kind of comfortable predictability that people often take for granted until it disappears. I was 25 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, working as a junior project manager at Greenbridge Architecture, and spending weekends with my father in the house where I had grown up in the Wallingford neighborhood. My world was small in geographic terms but felt secure in ways that made me believe I understood how life worked and what I could reasonably expect from the future. My apartment was nothing remarkable, just 800 square feet on the third floor of a building that had been constructed in the 1970s, and showed its age through persistent plumbing issues and windows that rattled when wind came off Lake Union. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to cook comfortably. The bathroom tile was cracked in places that the landlord kept promising to repair, and the carpet throughout was a beige color that had faded to something closer to gray. But the rent was manageable at $1,500 monthly. The location put me within walking distance of good coffee shops and grocery stores, and the building was quiet enough that I could sleep peacefully most nights. I had decorated the space with furniture from IKEA and second-hand stores, creating an environment that felt like mine even if nothing in it was particularly valuable or distinctive. A couch in dark blue fabric where I read novels on Sunday afternoons. A small dining table where I ate meals while working on my laptop. Bookshelves that held architecture volumes I studied to improve my professional knowledge alongside fiction I read for pleasure. Plants on the windowsill that I kept alive through careful attention to watering schedules. Photographs of my mother and father on the wall, reminding me daily of where I came from and who had shaped me into the person I was becoming. Greenbridge Architecture occupied the fourth floor of an older building in Pioneer Square, the kind of professional space that featured exposed brick walls and large windows that provided natural light throughout the workday. The firm specialized in sustainable design for residential and small commercial projects, working with clients who wanted to build or renovate structures that minimized environmental impact while maximizing functional beauty. We were not the largest or most prestigious architecture firm in Seattle, but we had developed a solid reputation for thoughtful work that balanced ecological principles with practical constraints of budget and building codes. My role as junior project manager meant I coordinated between architects, contractors, clients, and various regulatory agencies to ensure projects moved forward according to schedule and specification. I tracked timelines and budgets, organized meetings and site visits, maintained documentation of decisions and changes, and generally served as the operational backbone that allowed the creative designers to focus on their work without being overwhelmed by administrative details. The work required attention to detail, communication skills, patience with difficult personalities, and the ability to solve small problems before they became large ones. My supervisor was named Patricia Moreno, a woman in her late 40s who had worked in architecture for 25 years and had seen enough projects go wrong to be cautious without being cynical. She reviewed my work with thorough attention, but also gave me increasing autonomy as I demonstrated competence. She offered guidance when I encountered situations I had not navigated before, and trusted me to handle routine matters independently. She remembered details about my personal life and asked about my father's health when he became ill, offering flexibility with scheduling when I needed to take him to medical appointments. My colleagues were mostly people in their 30s and 40s who had chosen architecture because they cared about how built environments shaped human experience and environmental health. We had lunch together occasionally, discussing projects and sharing frustrations about difficult clients or contractors who did not follow specifications. We went out for drinks after particularly challenging weeks, celebrating completed projects or commiserating about proposals that had been rejected. The relationships were friendly without being deeply intimate, professional without being cold. Exactly the kind of workplace connections that make daily life pleasant without requiring emotional vulnerability. My salary at Greenbridge was $52,000 annually, enough to cover my rent and basic expenses with some left over for savings and occasional indulgences. I was not wealthy, but I was stable, able to pay my bills on time, and to maintain an emergency fund that provided psychological security even if the amount was modest. I contributed to a retirement account and carried health insurance through my employer. I took a vacation once a year, usually a week somewhere I could hike or visit museums. My lifestyle was solidly middle class, neither luxurious nor precarious, built on the foundation of steady employment and reasonable financial management. My father lived alone in the house where he had raised me after my mother died from complications of pneumonia when I was 8 years old. The house was a modest craftsman bungalow in Wallingford with 3 bedrooms, a small yard with fruit trees my mother had planted, and a basement workshop where my father spent hours building furniture and repairing things that broke. He had paid off the mortgage years earlier and maintained the property with meticulous care, understanding that a well-maintained house retains value and provides stability across decades. My father had emigrated from Taiwan when he was 22 years old, arriving in the United States to pursue graduate studies in computer science at the University of Washington. He had built his career through a combination of technical brilliance and strategic thinking, working first for Microsoft in its early expansion years, and then leaving to start his own software companies when he recognized opportunities that larger corporations were too risk-averse to pursue. He had sold his first company for $3 million when I was in high school and his second company for $8 million when I was in college, accumulating wealth that he managed quietly without ostentatious displays that might attract unwanted attention. He spoke English with a slight accent that became more pronounced when he was tired or speaking quickly. He moved through the world with the careful observation of someone who had learned to navigate cultural differences, and who understood that being underestimated could be strategically useful. He read voraciously in multiple languages, maintained friendships with people from dozens of countries, and believed that understanding how different cultures approached problems provided advantages in both business and personal life. Our relationship had always been close despite the inherent awkwardness of a father raising a daughter alone without a mother's guidance. He had learned to braid my hair by watching YouTube videos when I was young. He had navigated conversations about puberty and relationships with scientific directness that was sometimes embarrassing but never dismissive or shaming. He had attended every school event and performance, sitting in auditorium seats designed for smaller people, applauding enthusiastically for my mediocre violin recitals and adequate soccer games. He had helped me with homework in mathematics and science, while hiring tutors for subjects outside his expertise. He had supported my decision to study architecture rather than computer science, saying that people should pursue work that engages their particular combination of interests and abilities, rather than simply following their parents' paths. My Sundays were structured around dinner with my father at his house. I would arrive around 4 in the afternoon and we would cook together, usually something that required multiple steps and careful timing, because he believed that cooking well was a learnable skill that demonstrated respect for ingredients and for people who would eat the food. While we cooked, we talked about our weeks, about projects I was managing at work, about the books he was reading, about politics and technology, and whatever topics arose naturally in conversation. He asked questions that required more than superficial answers and listened with genuine attention to my responses, treating my observations as worthy of serious consideration, even when I was uncertain, or still forming my opinions. After dinner, we would walk around the neighborhood if weather permitted, or sit in his living room if it was raining, continuing conversations that ranged across subjects without agenda or time pressure. He would show me furniture he was building in his workshop or explain some new technology he was researching. I would tell him about challenges I was facing at work or questions I was thinking about regarding my future. These evenings provided continuity and stability, a regular touchstone that reminded me I was not alone in the world, and that I had someone who cared about my well-being without conditions or ulterior motives. I dated occasionally during this period, but nothing serious developed. I went out with a graphic designer named Tom for 3 months before we mutually agreed we enjoyed each other's company, but did not feel the kind of connection that justified long-term commitment. I had drinks with an attorney named Sarah twice before recognizing that her interest in me was primarily physical, while mine required emotional compatibility. I matched with various people on dating apps and met them for coffee or dinner, evaluating whether the distance between how they presented themselves online and who they actually were in person was acceptable or disqualifying. Most first dates did not lead to second ones, not because anything was terribly wrong, but because chemistry is rare and compatibility requires alignment across multiple dimensions that cannot be manufactured through effort alone. I was not desperately seeking a relationship, but I remained open to the possibility, believing that eventually I would meet someone with whom I could build genuine partnership based on mutual respect and aligned values. I wanted someone intelligent enough to have interesting conversations, emotionally mature enough to handle conflict without cruelty, ambitious enough to build toward meaningful goals, and kind enough to treat other people with basic human decency. These requirements seemed reasonable rather than impossibly demanding, though I was learning through experience that finding someone who met all of them simultaneously was more difficult than I had imagined when I was younger. My friend circle consisted primarily of former college classmates who had also stayed in Seattle after graduation, building careers in architecture, urban planning, technology, and nonprofit work. We met for brunch on weekends and attended concerts or art exhibitions together. We helped each other move into new apartments and celebrated birthdays with dinners at restaurants we could barely afford. We offered emotional support through breakups and job searches and family difficulties. These friendships provided social connection without the intensity or obligation of romantic relationships, creating a network of people who knew me well enough to notice when something was wrong, but who also respected boundaries around privacy and independence. I volunteered once a month at a community organization that helped low-income families navigate the process of applying for housing assistance and connecting with social services. The work was modest in scope but felt meaningful because it provided practical help to people facing challenges I had never experienced personally due to my father's financial stability and my own educational advantages. I met families who worked multiple jobs and still struggled to pay rent, who navigated bureaucratic systems designed without consideration for people who did not speak fluent English or who lacked reliable internet access, who made impossible choices between medication and food because their budgets could not accommodate both. The volunteer work reminded me that my comfortable circumstances were contingent on factors beyond my individual effort, and that supporting others was both moral obligation and practical investment in community well-being. My life during this period was not dramatically eventful, but it was substantive and satisfying. I was building professional competence in work that aligned with my values. I was maintaining relationships with people I genuinely cared about. I was developing skills and knowledge that would serve me throughout my life. I was financially stable without being wealthy. I had enough security to sleep peacefully and enough challenge to continue growing. Looking back from my current position, I recognize that I took this stability for granted in ways that only become visible when stability disappears. I met Marcus Khalil at a professional networking event organized by the Seattle chapter of the Urban Land Institute, a gathering designed to connect people working in real estate development, architecture, urban planning, and related fields. The event was held at a hotel conference room downtown with the standard setup of name tags, beverage stations, and small tables where people could set down drinks while attempting to have conversations over ambient noise. I had attended similar events before and found them mildly tedious but professionally useful. Opportunities to meet potential clients or collaborators, even if most interactions remained superficial. Marcus had approached me near the end of the evening when I was considering leaving. He introduced himself as a software consultant working with property management companies to improve their operational systems. He was perhaps 30 years old with dark hair and warm brown eyes, wearing a gray suit that fit well without looking like he had spent excessive time selecting it. His handshake was firm and his smile seemed genuine rather than performatively professional. He asked what brought me to the event and listened attentively when I explained my work at Greenbridge Architecture, asking follow-up questions that suggested actual interest, rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. We spoke for approximately 20 minutes about how architecture and property management technology intersected, about challenges in sustainable building design, about Seattle's changing urban landscape, and what it meant for longtime residents. His knowledge was substantive without being showy, and his manner was confident without arrogance. When the event officially ended and staff began clearing tables, he asked if I would like to continue the conversation over coffee sometime. I agreed because he seemed intelligent and interesting and because the interaction had felt natural rather than forced. Our first coffee meeting lasted 2 hours at a cafe in Fremont. Marcus arrived exactly on time wearing casual clothes that suggested he had come from home rather than from work. He ordered an Americano and asked questions about my background, my education, my interest in sustainable architecture, and my perspective on various Seattle neighborhoods. He shared information about his own history, explaining that he had grown up in the area after his parents immigrated from Lebanon when he was a child, that he had studied computer science at the University of Washington, and that he had worked for several years at a large tech company before leaving to do independent consulting work that offered more flexibility and variety. He spoke fondly about his family, describing his mother as an exceptional cook who maintained Lebanese culinary traditions, and his father as a businessman who had built a successful import-export company through careful relationship building and attention to quality. He mentioned 2 younger sisters who were still in college, and an extended family network that gathered regularly for meals and celebrations. His description of family life contrasted sharply with my own experience as an only child with a single parent, and I found myself envious of the large family system he took for granted. The conversation flowed easily across topics without awkward silences or forced transitions. Marcus was well-read and could discuss books, current events, and ideas with nuance that suggested he thought carefully about things rather than simply adopting popular opinions. He was curious about my perspectives and treated my observations as valuable rather than dismissing them or talking over me as some men did when they felt the need to demonstrate intellectual superiority. When we parted after those 2 hours, I felt energized rather than drained, interested in continuing to know him better. We began dating with the gradual progression that characterized mature adult relationships rather than the intense immediacy of college romances. We met for dinner once or twice a week at restaurants ranging from casual Vietnamese soup houses to more formal establishments where we split bills rather than falling into gendered assumptions about who should pay. We went to movies and discussed them afterward over drinks. We attended a Mariners game despite neither of us being particularly passionate about baseball, enjoying the social ritual more than the sport itself. We took a day trip to the San Juan Islands on the ferry, walking along beaches and through small towns, learning how the other person moved through spaces and responded to beauty and managed the minor irritations of travel. Marcus met my father for the first time about 6 weeks after we began dating. I had invited him to one of our Sunday dinners, wanting to see how he interacted with the most important person in my life, and how my father responded to him. The evening had gone well with Marcus showing appropriate respect for my father's age and experience while also engaging in substantive conversation rather than simply deferring to authority. They discovered shared interest in programming languages and software architecture, spending part of the evening discussing technical details that went beyond my comprehension, but which clearly pleased my father, who rarely found people who could follow his thinking in those domains. After Marcus left that evening, my father had commented that he seemed intelligent and thoughtful, that he treated me with obvious respect, and that his family background suggested he understood the importance of maintaining connections across generations. My father did not offer effusive approval because that was not his style, but his measured positive assessment carried weight precisely because he was not someone who complimented people casually or without genuine basis. Our relationship deepened over months through accumulated experiences and growing comfort with each other's presence. Marcus was affectionate without being possessive, attentive without being suffocating, ambitious about his work without being consumed by it. He remembered details about my projects and asked how they were progressing. He offered help when I faced challenges without trying to take over or solve problems I needed to work through myself. He introduced me to his friends and integrated me into his social circle, while also respecting my existing friendships and encouraging me to maintain those connections. I met his family for the first time about 4 months into our relationship, when his mother invited me to dinner at their home in Bellevue. The house was large and expensively furnished with an aesthetic that favored heavy furniture and ornate decoration. His mother Amira was warm and welcoming, hugging me when I arrived and immediately making me feel like an honored guest. His father Kareem was more reserved but polite, asking about my work and nodding thoughtfully at my responses. His sisters were friendly and curious, asking questions about how Marcus and I had met, and whether he was treating me well. The dinner itself was elaborate with multiple courses that Amira had prepared according to traditional recipes she had learned from her own mother in Lebanon. The food was delicious and the conversation was lively, with family members talking over each other in ways that felt chaotic to me, but which they navigated easily through long practice. They switched between English and Arabic fluidly, sometimes within the same sentence, and while I understood the Arabic portions, I did not mention this ability because it seemed irrelevant to the social dynamics of the evening. Marcus's uncle Rashid was also present at that first family dinner. He was perhaps 50 years old with silver in his hair, and an air of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to and respected. He asked about my father's background and seemed particularly interested when I mentioned that my father had built and sold software companies. He made some comment about always looking for good business partners and about how immigrant entrepreneurs often understood opportunities that established companies missed. The conversation moved on to other topics and I thought nothing more about his interest at the time. After that initial meeting, I was included in various Khalil family gatherings including birthday celebrations, holiday meals, and casual Sunday dinners that followed the same pattern as my dinners with my father, but with far more people and far more noise. I appreciated being welcomed into their family system, even as I sometimes felt overwhelmed by the number of people and the volume of simultaneous conversations. Marcus would check in with me periodically during these gatherings to make sure I was comfortable, and would translate Arabic conversations when he remembered that I might not understand what was being said, unaware that I followed every word perfectly well. My father's health began declining about 1 year into my relationship with Marcus. He had been experiencing persistent stomach pain and digestive issues that he initially attributed to aging and stress. When the symptoms worsened despite dietary changes and over-the-counter medications, he finally agreed to see a doctor who ordered various tests. The diagnosis came back as pancreatic cancer, stage 3, with a prognosis that suggested he had perhaps 12 to 18 months remaining even with aggressive treatment. The news shattered the stable foundation of my life in ways I had not anticipated. My father had always been my constant, the person who would be there regardless of what else changed. And suddenly I was forced to confront the reality that he was mortal, and that I would soon be navigating the world without his guidance and support. The grief began before he died, manifesting as anticipatory loss that colored every interaction with awareness that our time was finite and diminishing. Marcus was exceptionally supportive during this period, or so it seemed at the time. He accompanied me to medical appointments when my father wanted someone there to help process information the doctors provided. He researched treatment options and clinical trials, presenting findings for my father's consideration. He helped with practical matters like organizing medications and scheduling various specialists. He held me when I cried and listened when I needed to talk about my fear and sadness. He told me repeatedly that I was not alone, and that he would be there for me through everything that was coming. His family also offered support that felt genuine and compassionate. Amira brought meals to my father's house so that neither of us had to worry about cooking during difficult weeks. Rashid offered to help with any business or financial matters that might be too complex for me to handle alone, saying that my father should focus on his health rather than on administrative details. Marcus's sisters sent cards and text messages expressing sympathy and offering to help with anything I needed. The Khalil family seemed to have embraced me fully, treating my father's illness as something that affected their family as well because I was being integrated into their network of care and obligation. My father underwent chemotherapy that made him violently ill without significantly slowing the cancer's progression. He lost weight rapidly and his skin took on a grayish pallor that made him look far older than his 62 years. His thick dark hair fell out in clumps until he decided to shave his head completely rather than watching it disappear gradually. His energy diminished until even short conversations left him exhausted. He continued working as long as possible, because he said that maintaining purpose was more important than conserving energy for a future that was foreclosed regardless of how much he rested. During this period, Rashid approached my father about a business partnership involving property management software that would leverage my father's expertise in software architecture and Rashid's connections in real estate development. My father was initially skeptical about taking on new projects given his health situation, but Rashid argued that the work could be structured to require minimal time commitment while providing ongoing revenue that would benefit me after my father was gone. The proposal seemed to emphasize my father's legacy and his desire to ensure I was financially secure, framing the partnership as an act of paternal love rather than a business transaction. My father agreed to the partnership after consulting with his attorneys and accountants who reviewed the proposed terms and found them acceptable. Contracts were signed establishing joint ownership of intellectual property that would be developed and specifying revenue-sharing arrangements. Rashid began attending meetings at my father's house to discuss technical specifications and market positioning. Marcus was sometimes present at these meetings because the software would interface with systems he worked on professionally, and his input was characterized as valuable for ensuring the product would integrate smoothly with existing property management platforms. I appreciated that the Khalil family was giving my father a project to focus on beyond his illness, and was including him in planning that extended beyond his expected lifespan. It seemed like respect for his continued capacity and acknowledgement that his knowledge remained valuable even as his body failed. I did not recognize that they were positioning themselves to claim ownership of assets and intellectual property that my father was developing, that the partnership terms were structured to benefit them disproportionately, or that their attentiveness to my father during his final months was strategic cultivation rather than genuine care. Marcus proposed to me 9 months after my father's diagnosis, at a point when it was clear that my father had perhaps 3 or 4 months remaining. We were on a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands that Marcus had organized, staying at a small inn with views of the water. He proposed at sunset while we were walking along the beach, getting down on one knee in the sand and presenting a ring that caught the failing light. He told me that he loved me and wanted to build a life with me, that he wanted to support me through the loss of my father and beyond, and that he hoped I would agree to marry him. I said yes because I loved him and because I believed he loved me. I said yes because I was facing the loss of my only parent and the prospect of being completely alone in the world terrified me. I said yes because Marcus and his family had shown me kindness during the darkest period of my life, and I was grateful for their support. I said yes because getting married seemed like a natural progression of our relationship, and because I could not identify any good reason to refuse. I said yes without understanding that the timing of his proposal was calculated to maximize my vulnerability and my dependence on the stability he offered. My father died 4 months after Marcus proposed, on a Tuesday morning in October with autumn rain falling outside the windows of the hospice facility where he had spent his final 2 weeks. I was holding his hand when his breathing slowed and then stopped, watching the man who had raised me and shaped me transform from person to body in the space between one breath and its absence. Marcus was there with me, standing slightly behind my chair with his hand on my shoulder, providing physical support while I experienced the most profound loss of my life. The funeral was small because my father had not been someone who cultivated large social networks. Colleagues from his various business ventures attended. Few longtime friends came. My own friends showed up to support me. The Khalil family attended in force with Amira, Rashid, and various other relatives filling an entire row of seats, their presence somehow both comforting and overwhelming. Marcus delivered a brief eulogy about my father's brilliance and kindness, about how he had welcomed Marcus into our small family, about how his legacy would continue through the work he had done and through the daughter he had raised. After the funeral, Rashid approached me to express condolences and to mention gently that there were business matters related to the partnership with my father that would need attention once I had time to address such things. He assured me that there was no rush, but that eventually we would need to discuss intellectual property rights, revenue sharing arrangements, and various contractual obligations that survived my father's death. His tone was sympathetic and respectful, suggesting that he understood my grief but also that practical matters could not be indefinitely postponed. I appreciated what seemed like his patience and understanding, not recognizing that he was establishing groundwork for claims he planned to make against my father's estate. In the weeks after my father's death, I moved through days in a fog of grief that made everything feel distant and unreal. I returned to work at Greenbridge Architecture, but struggled to focus on project details that seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of what I had lost. I went through the motions of maintaining my apartment and paying bills and responding to emails, performing the administrative tasks of being alive without feeling particularly present in my own life. Marcus was patient with my grief, not pushing me to be cheerful or to move on quickly, simply being present and handling practical matters that I could not bring myself to address. The Khalil family continued to include me in their gatherings, and to treat me as someone who belonged to their network. Their consistent presence provided structure during a period when my own life felt formless and empty. I was grateful for their acceptance and for the way they seemed to understand that grief takes time and does not follow predictable trajectories. I believed I had been fortunate to find not only a partner, but an entire family system that would support me as I rebuilt my life after devastating loss. I had no idea that every gesture of support was calculated, that every expression of sympathy was strategic, that every inclusion in their family gatherings was designed to deepen my dependence and obligation. I had no idea that they had targeted me deliberately before I ever met Marcus, that our relationship had been constructed rather than developed organically, or that my father's death had simply been a convenient opportunity to accelerate plans they had been developing since the beginning. I believed I understood my life and my relationships and my future. I was wrong about almost everything. The 3 months following my father's funeral passed in a fog of grief that made everything feel muted and distant, as if I were experiencing life through layers of gauze that prevented direct contact with reality. I returned to work at Greenbridge Architecture 2 weeks after the funeral, forcing myself back into professional routines because staying home alone in my apartment felt unbearable, and because I needed the structure that employment provided. My colleagues were sympathetic and careful around me, offering condolences and asking periodically how I was managing, but the office had its own rhythms and demands that could not be indefinitely suspended to accommodate my personal tragedy. Marcus was extraordinarily attentive during this period in ways that seemed to confirm I had been fortunate to find a partner who understood that grief required patience and sustained support, rather than the temporary sympathy that most people offered before returning their attention to their own lives. He checked in with me multiple times daily through text messages and phone calls, asking how I was feeling and whether I needed anything. He came to my apartment most evenings after work, bringing takeout food because he knew I was not cooking for myself and ensuring I ate at least one substantial meal each day. He held me when waves of sadness crashed over me without warning, not trying to fix or minimize my grief, but simply providing physical presence that reminded me I was not entirely alone. He helped me begin sorting through my father's belongings at the house in Wallingford, a task that felt overwhelming in its emotional weight and practical complexity. We spent weekend afternoons going through closets and drawers, deciding what should be donated and what I wanted to keep for sentimental value. Marcus was patient with the slow pace of this work, understanding that every object carried memories that needed processing before I could make decisions about disposition. He packed boxes and carried heavy items and handled logistics that I found impossible to manage while emotionally raw. His family continued to include me in their gatherings, and to treat me as someone who belonged within their network despite my grief and despite the fact that Marcus and I were not yet married. Amira called regularly to check on me, and to invite me to family dinners, saying that being around people who cared about me was healthier than isolating myself. When I attended these dinners, which I did occasionally because refusing seemed ungracious given their evident concern, they made space for my sadness without requiring me to perform cheerfulness I did not feel. They asked about my father and shared their own stories of losing parents, creating conversations that acknowledged grief as normal rather than treating it as something uncomfortable to avoid. Rashid was particularly solicitous during this period, expressing interest in ensuring that my father's business affairs were being handled properly, and offering to review estate documents or financial arrangements if I found them confusing or overwhelming. He emphasized that my father would have wanted me to be protected, and that having experienced guidance through complex legal and financial processes was prudent rather than evidence of inability to manage independently. His offer seemed motivated by genuine concern for my well-being and by respect for my father's memory, so I appreciated his willingness to help even though I had not yet taken him up on specific offers of assistance. Despite the support I was receiving from Marcus and his family, something felt increasingly wrong in ways I could not articulate clearly or point to with concrete evidence. The feeling started as vague unease that I attributed to grief distorting my perceptions and making me hypersensitive to minor irregularities that probably meant nothing. But as weeks passed, the unease intensified rather than diminishing, manifesting as a persistent sense that I was missing something important about my circumstances, or that people around me knew things they were not sharing. The first specific warning sign I consciously registered occurred approximately 6 weeks after my father's funeral during a Sunday dinner at the Khalil family home. I had arrived with Marcus in the late afternoon and had spent time in the kitchen helping Amira and her sister prepare food, while the men gathered in the living room watching a soccer match and discussing politics. The atmosphere was comfortable and domestic, exactly the kind of ordinary family gathering that provided relief from the intensity of grief I carried constantly. At some point during the meal preparation, I left the kitchen to use the bathroom down the hallway. As I approached the living room on my way back to the kitchen, I heard Rashid speaking in Arabic to Kareem and to one of the older cousins whose name I had not yet learned. They were discussing something related to property and partnerships and timelines, speaking in tones that suggested business conversation rather than casual exchange. What caught my attention was hearing my father's name mentioned followed by phrases about estate settlement and access to assets. I stopped in the hallway outside the living room, not yet visible to the people inside but close enough to hear their conversation clearly. Rashid was saying something about ensuring that documentation was filed properly before certain deadlines that would affect claims to intellectual property. Kareem responded with a comment about the importance of maintaining good relationships during transition periods. The older cousin said something I did not catch completely but which included references to my emotional state and to the strategic value of patience. The conversation shifted to English as someone noticed my approach, and they moved seamlessly into discussion of the soccer match they had been watching. I entered the living room and they greeted me warmly without any indication that I had interrupted something they preferred to keep private. Rashid asked how the food preparation was progressing, and whether Amira was making him carry heavy pots as she always did. Everyone laughed and the moment passed as if it had been entirely ordinary. But the unease I had been feeling crystallized into something sharper. Why had they been discussing my father's estate in Arabic rather than in English, which they all spoke fluently? Why had the conversation shifted so abruptly when they became aware of my presence? What did Rashid mean about documentation and deadlines related to intellectual property claims? And what did the cousin's comment about my emotional state and strategic patience refer to? I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me suspicious of innocent conversations, that business partners naturally discussed estate settlement matters, and that using Arabic for such discussions was simply more comfortable for them when speaking among themselves. I reminded myself that Rashid had been genuinely helpful to my father during his illness, and had offered to help me navigate complex business matters. I convinced myself that if something problematic were happening, my father's attorneys would have identified it and would have warned me. But the feeling would not entirely dissipate. I found myself paying closer attention to conversations around me and noticing patterns I had not consciously registered before. The Khalil family frequently switched between English and Arabic during gatherings in ways that seemed to correlate with topic sensitivity. When discussing ordinary matters like food or weather or children's activities, they spoke English. When conversations turned to business or money or future planning, they often shifted to Arabic. I had always assumed this was simply linguistic comfort with their native language for complex topics, but now I wondered if it served the additional function of privacy from anyone present who they assumed could not understand. I also began noticing that Marcus asked questions about my father's business activities and estate settlement with what seemed like unusual frequency and specificity. During conversations about my day or about tasks I needed to complete, he would inquire about meetings with attorneys or accountants, about documents I was reviewing, about decisions I was making regarding property disposition or financial accounts. His questions were always framed as supportive interest in helping me manage overwhelming responsibilities, but the cumulative effect felt less like partnership and more like information gathering. When I mentioned to Marcus that I had scheduled a meeting with Michael Brennan to review estate documents, Marcus immediately offered to accompany me to provide support and to help me understand complex legal language. His offer seemed thoughtful and I appreciated his willingness to dedicate time to helping me, but something about his eagerness to be present for legal consultations triggered that same vague alarm I was increasingly unable to dismiss. I told him I thought I should handle the initial meeting alone because I needed to learn to manage these matters independently, even though having support available was comforting. He accepted this explanation but seemed disappointed in a way that felt disproportionate to the situation. Another warning sign emerged when I received a call from one of my father's former business associates, a software developer named Thomas Chun, who had worked with my father on various projects over the years. Thomas asked if we could meet for coffee, because he had some questions about intellectual property rights related to software my father had developed. He mentioned that he had been contacted by attorneys representing Rashid Khalil, who were claiming that certain code and patents were actually joint property under the partnership agreement, and Thomas wanted to verify with me whether this was accurate, because it contradicted his understanding of my father's work and ownership. The call troubled me significantly because I had not known that Rashid was making claims to my father's intellectual property beyond what had been explicitly developed as part of their partnership. When I mentioned Thomas's call to Marcus that evening, asking if he knew anything about the legal claims Rashid was making, Marcus's response was careful and measured in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He said that business partnerships often had complicated intellectual property provisions that covered more than just explicitly collaborative work, that Rashid was probably just ensuring his legal rights were protected appropriately, and that I should not worry because attorneys would sort out any disputes according to proper legal procedures. His reassurance did not ease my concern. Instead, it heightened my suspicion that Marcus knew more about Rashid's legal claims than he was sharing with me, and that his sympathetic support might be covering knowledge that would alarm me if I understood its full implications. I decided to meet with Thomas without mentioning the meeting to Marcus. A small act of information control that felt both necessary and like a betrayal of the trust one thought we shared. Thomas and I met at a coffee shop near the University of Washington campus on a gray afternoon when rain fell steadily enough to require umbrellas, but not heavily enough to keep people indoors. Thomas was perhaps 40 years old with the slightly disheveled appearance of someone who spent most of his time focused on code rather than personal presentation. He ordered black coffee and got directly to the point without social preliminaries. The attorneys representing Rashid Khalil have sent letters claiming that essentially all of your father's software work over the past 5 years falls under the partnership agreement because it relates to property management systems, even when it was not explicitly developed for the joint venture. They are arguing that the partnership terms grant Rashid rights to any intellectual property your father created in related fields during the partnership period. This interpretation seems wildly expansive and probably not legally supportable, but it suggests they are planning to make aggressive claims that will require expensive litigation to contest. Thomas pulled out copies of the letters he had received and showed me the legal language claiming rights to various software components and patents. The scope of the claims was breathtaking, essentially asserting that Rashid owned or co-owned virtually everything my father had created professionally during the final 2 years of his life. If these claims were accepted, the value of my inheritance would be dramatically reduced because the most valuable assets in my father's estate were intellectual property rights that generated ongoing royalty income. I felt coldness spreading through my chest as I read the legal documents Thomas had brought. This was not normal business partnership dispute. This was systematic attempt to claim ownership of assets that clearly belonged to my father's independent work. And the timing of these claims, coming just months after my father's death when I was emotionally vulnerable and professionally occupied with grief, suggested strategic calculation rather than good faith legal disagreement. Did my father ever mention concerns about his partnership with Rashid? I asked Thomas, or indicate that he thought something was wrong with their arrangement? Thomas hesitated before responding, choosing his words carefully. Your father became increasingly concerned during his final year. He made comments about feeling pressured to sign amendments to their partnership agreement, and about certain terms being different in final documents than what had been discussed verbally. He talked about wanting to document everything more carefully, and about needing to protect you from potential claims after his death. He asked me several times to confirm in writing that specific software components were his independent work not connected to the joint venture with Rashid. At the time I thought he was just being cautious because he knew he was dying. Now I am wondering if he suspected something more concerning. The conversation with Thomas crystallized my vague unease into active alarm. My father had been worried about Rashid's intentions. He had taken steps to document ownership and to protect assets. He had recognized that something was wrong even if he had not fully understood the scope of what he was facing. And now, months after his death, aggressive legal claims were being made that would require me to fight expensive litigation to defend what should rightfully be mine. When I returned home that evening, Marcus asked casually how my day had been, and whether I had accomplished the errands I had mentioned that morning. I told him my day had been fine and that I had taken care of various tasks without being more specific. His expression showed mild curiosity, but he did not press for details. We ate dinner together and watched television and went to bed, the evening unfolding with comfortable domesticity that should have felt reassuring but which now felt performative and false. I lay awake that night after Marcus fell asleep beside me, listening to his steady breathing and feeling the warmth of his body close to mine while my mind raced through implications and possibilities I had been trying not to see. What if Marcus's interest in me had not been coincidental? What if his family had identified my father as someone worth targeting, and had positioned Marcus to cultivate a relationship with me as part of a longer-term strategy? What if the partnership between my father and Rashid had been designed from the beginning to create legal mechanisms for claiming assets after my father's death? What if everything I believed about my relationship with Marcus was carefully constructed deception rather than genuine love? The thoughts felt paranoid and disloyal. I was accusing my fiancé and his family of conspiracy and fraud based on fragmentary evidence and suspicious timing, rather than on definitive proof of wrongdoing. I reminded myself that business partnerships often involved disputes that seemed aggressive, but were actually normal legal positioning. I told myself that Marcus's questions about estate matters reflected supportive interest, rather than intelligence gathering. I tried to convince myself that I was allowing grief and stress to distort my perceptions and create patterns where only coincidence existed. But I could not entirely silence the voice insisting that something was fundamentally wrong. The voice pointed out that I had overheard a conversation about estate settlement and strategic patience that made no sense if Rashid's interest was purely legitimate business protection. The voice noted that Marcus's eagerness to attend legal meetings and his specific questions about documents and decisions went beyond normal supportive partnership. The voice observed that my father had expressed concerns and had taken unusual steps to document ownership during his final year, suggesting he had recognized threats I was only now beginning to see. I decided that I needed to investigate further before either dismissing my concerns as paranoia or confronting Marcus with accusations I could not substantiate. I would pay closer attention to conversations around me and would document anything that seemed inconsistent or suspicious. I would review all documents related to my father's partnership with Rashid and would ask Michael Brennan specific questions about the intellectual property claims Thomas had described. I would begin gathering information that would either confirm that I was being paranoid or would provide evidence that my instincts were correctly identifying danger. The following weeks brought additional warning signs that accumulated into a pattern I could no longer rationalize as coincidence or normal business activity. I discovered that Marcus had been accessing my laptop when I was not present, evident from browser history showing searches I had not conducted and from files being opened at times when I was not home. When I asked him about this casually, saying I had noticed some unexpected activity on my computer, he claimed he had borrowed it briefly when his own laptop was updating and had needed to check email. His explanation was plausible, but the specific searches I found in the history were all related to estate law and intellectual property transfers rather than to email or his work projects. I also began noticing that when I received mail related to estate matters or legal correspondence from my father's attorneys, Marcus would ask to see the documents before I had mentioned receiving them. This suggested he was monitoring my mail delivery in ways that felt invasive rather than supportive. When I questioned how he knew I had received legal correspondence, he would say he had noticed the envelope when checking for his own mail, or that I had mentioned expecting documents even when I was certain I had not discussed it with him. During family gatherings at the Khalil home, I started paying careful attention to conversations conducted in Arabic, and discovered that my name was mentioned with surprising frequency in discussions I was presumably not meant to understand. I caught references to my emotional state, to my meetings with attorneys, to my relationships with my father's former business associates, and to timeline considerations that seemed connected to legal deadlines I was unaware of. The conversations never included enough detail that I could understand their full context, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The Khalil family was monitoring my activities closely, and was coordinating their responses to my actions in ways that suggested strategic planning, rather than casual family interest. One evening when Marcus and I were having dinner at a restaurant near my apartment, I mentioned casually that I had been thinking about postponing our wedding by several months because planning felt overwhelming while I was still processing grief about my father. Marcus's response to this suggestion was immediate and intense in a way that seemed disproportionate to what I had proposed. He became agitated and insisted that postponing would be a mistake, that moving forward with our lives together was exactly what I needed for healing, that establishing our marriage would provide stability and structure that would help me through the difficult transition I was experiencing. His vehemence about maintaining the wedding timeline struck me as odd. Most partners would understand that grief makes major life celebrations feel burdensome, and would be flexible about timing to accommodate their fiancé's emotional needs. Marcus's insistence that the wedding proceed according to schedule despite my expressed discomfort suggested that the timeline mattered to him for reasons he was not articulating. I wondered if legal deadlines or strategic considerations were driving his urgency, rather than genuine desire to formalize our commitment at a particular time. I began feeling increasingly uncomfortable in Marcus's presence, even as I tried to maintain normal behavior and affectionate responses. My body was registering danger through persistent low-level anxiety that manifested as difficulty sleeping, reduced appetite, and a constant sense of vigilance that exhausted me. I found myself analyzing everything Marcus said, looking for hidden meanings or inconsistencies that might confirm my growing suspicions. I noticed how he deflected certain questions or changed subjects when I asked about his family's business activities, or about specific terms in the partnership agreement between my father and Rashid. The warning signs were accumulating too rapidly, and with too much consistency to dismiss as paranoid interpretation of innocent behavior. Something was wrong. Marcus and his family were not what they appeared to be. My relationship was not what I had believed it to be. My father's concerns during his final year had been justified, and I had failed to take them seriously because I had been too trusting and too eager to believe that the support being offered was genuine rather than strategic. But I still did not understand the full scope of what I was facing, or have definitive evidence of the conspiracy I increasingly suspected existed. I needed something concrete, something that would either confirm my fears with enough clarity that I could act decisively, or would prove that I was catastrophically wrong, and was destroying a relationship and alienating a family based on grief-distorted perceptions. That concrete evidence would arrive at the engagement dinner in the form of a conversation conducted in Arabic by people who assumed I could not understand a word they were saying. The conversation that would reveal not just that I had been correct to suspect deception, but that the reality was far worse than anything I had imagined. The conversation that would show me that every warning sign I had noticed was part of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had been targeting me since before I ever met Marcus, that had exploited my father's illness and my grief, and that had constructed my entire relationship and engagement as mechanisms for theft rather than expressions of love. But I did not know any of that yet as I moved through those weeks of mounting suspicion and growing dread. I only knew that something was terribly wrong, and that I needed to understand what I was facing before it was too late to defend myself, or to protect what my father had worked his entire life to build and had intended for me to inherit. I needed to know the truth even if the truth destroyed everything I thought I understood about my life and my future. The truth was coming whether I was prepared for it or not. The engagement dinner at the Khalil family home had been scheduled for a Saturday evening in late April, precisely 6 months after Marcus had proposed on the beach in the San Juan Islands. Spring had arrived in Seattle with the characteristic pattern of rain punctuated by occasional brilliant sunshine that made the city's residents emerge from their winter hibernation with something approaching euphoria. The cherry trees were blooming throughout the neighborhoods, and the air carried that particular smell of wet earth and new growth that signals seasonal transformation. Marcus had picked me up from my apartment at 5 in the afternoon, driving his silver Audi sedan through traffic toward Bellevue while discussing the guest list for the evening. His extended family would be attending, including his parents Amira and Kareem, his uncle Rashid and Aunt Nadia, his 2 younger sisters Layla and Hannah who were home from college for the weekend, and various cousins whose names I had learned to recognize even if I sometimes confused which person belonged to which family branch. The gathering would celebrate our upcoming marriage officially within the broader family network, establishing me formally as someone who would be integrated into their generational continuity. I had dressed carefully for the evening in a navy blue dress that was elegant without being overly formal, appropriate for a family celebration that carried significance without being an actual wedding event. I wore minimal jewelry and shoes that were comfortable enough to wear for several hours without causing pain. My hair was styled in a way that looked polished but not like I had spent excessive time achieving the effect. I wanted to present myself as someone who respected the occasion without appearing to try too hard, or to be uncomfortable in formal settings. The drive to Bellevue took 40 minutes through Saturday evening traffic. Marcus talked about work projects he was managing and asked about my week at Greenbridge Architecture. We discussed wedding planning logistics, including venue selection, catering options, and the ongoing challenge of blending our 2 cultural traditions in ways that honored both backgrounds without becoming so complex that the celebration would be overwhelmed by ceremonial requirements. The conversation was comfortable and familiar, the kind of easy exchange that develops between people who have spent years learning each other's communication patterns and areas of interest. The Khalil family home sat on a large lot in a gated community where houses were positioned with enough distance between them that neighbors enjoyed both privacy and the prestige of exclusive addresses. The architecture was Mediterranean revival with a tile roof and stucco exterior in a warm beige color. The landscaping featured mature trees and professionally maintained gardens with early spring flowers blooming in careful arrangements. The circular driveway could accommodate numerous vehicles and was already filling with cars when we arrived, indicating that other family members had arrived before us. Amira greeted us at the front door with embraces and rapid-fire commentary about how beautiful I looked and how happy she was that we were all gathering to celebrate properly. She was wearing a burgundy dress with gold jewelry that caught the light, and her hair was styled in elaborate waves that must have required significant time to achieve. Her energy was warm and welcoming in the way of someone who genuinely enjoys hosting and who takes pleasure in bringing people together. She ushered us inside where other family members were already gathered in the large living room that opened into the dining area. The interior of the house reflected the same aesthetic I had observed during previous visits, favoring heavy furniture and dark woods, ornate rugs that appeared to be antique or high-quality reproductions, and extensive use of decorative objects that suggested wealth accumulated over time rather than recently acquired. Family photographs covered multiple surfaces showing various Khalil family members at weddings and graduations and holiday celebrations across decades. The overall effect was of a family proud of its history and its achievements, maintaining connections across generations and geography. Rashid was holding court near the fireplace, discussing something with two of his nephews while gesturing with a glass of whiskey. He acknowledged my arrival with a nod and a smile, then returned to his conversation. Nadia was in the kitchen with Amira's sister helping with final food preparations. The younger cousins were clustered around the dining table, examining the place settings and discussing seating arrangements. Marcus's sisters approached me immediately, hugging me and complimenting my dress and asking questions about wedding dress shopping and honeymoon plans. The evening proceeded with the rhythm of a large family gathering where conversations overlapped and people moved between groups, and the noise level rose as more people arrived, and as wine and other drinks were consumed. I found myself talking with various family members about topics ranging from their work and studies to their opinions about Seattle's changing housing market to their memories of Lebanon and their perspectives on maintaining cultural traditions in immigrant families. Everyone was friendly and inclusive, making efforts to ensure I felt welcomed and valued as someone who would soon be formally joining their family network. Dinner was announced at 7:30, and we all moved to the large dining table that had been extended to accommodate 18 people. Place cards indicated where each person should sit, with Marcus and I positioned near the center of the table, flanked by his parents and siblings. The seating arrangement felt deliberate in placing me among the core family members rather than at the end with more distant relatives, a gesture that I interpreted as acceptance and honor. The meal itself was spectacular even by Amira's high standards. She had been cooking for 2 days according to Marcus, preparing dishes that represented her culinary expertise and her desire to impress and please. The table held lamb that had been marinated overnight and roasted until the meat fell off the bone with minimal pressure. Rice pilaf studded with almonds and raisins that added texture and sweetness to the savory grain. Faddish salad with vegetables so fresh they must have been purchased that morning, and with sumac providing the distinctive tangy flavor. Hummus that was impossibly smooth and rich, made from dried chickpeas that had been soaked and cooked according to traditional methods. Baba ganoush with perfectly charred eggplant flavor. Fresh bread that was still warm from the oven. Small plates of olives and pickled vegetables for those who wanted additional salt and acid to balance the richness of the main dishes. The dinner conversation flowed across topics as dishes were passed and plates were filled and people began eating with the appreciation that good food deserves. Amira accepted compliments on her cooking with pleasure, explaining techniques and ingredients to those who asked questions about how specific dishes were prepared. Kareem led a toast to Marcus and me, speaking about the importance of family and the joy of watching children build their own families, and the hope that our marriage would be blessed with health and happiness and many years together. I felt genuinely moved by the warmth of the evening, and by the obvious pleasure the Khalil family took in gathering together, and in welcoming me into their midst. After 6 months of grief following my father's death, the experience of being embraced by a large family system provided comfort and a sense of belonging that I had been missing acutely. I looked around the table at faces that were becoming familiar and felt grateful that Marcus had brought this extended network into my life, along with his individual love and partnership. The main course concluded around 9 o'clock and Amira announced that dessert would be served shortly, but that people should take a break to let their food settle. Several of the younger family members excused themselves to the basement where a television and comfortable seating provided space for them to watch videos or play games away from adult conversation. Others moved to the living room to continue discussions in more comfortable seating. I excused myself to use the restroom, walking down the hallway that led to the guest bathroom near the back of the house. The hallway was lined with framed photographs documenting Khalil family history across multiple generations. I paused briefly to examine images I had not studied closely during previous visits, looking at black and white photographs that appeared to be from Lebanon decades earlier, showing people in formal clothing standing in front of stone buildings. More recent color photographs showed the family in America at various life events, documenting their immigration story and their success in building prosperity in their adopted country. The guest bathroom was elegant with marble countertops and expensive fixtures. I used the facilities and washed my hands, checking my appearance in the mirror and noting that I looked tired despite my careful makeup application earlier. The emotional weight of the evening combined with the rich food and the wine I had consumed was creating a pleasant exhaustion that suggested I would sleep deeply when we eventually returned to my apartment. When I opened the bathroom door to return to the main gathering, I heard voices speaking in Arabic coming from the partially open door of what I knew was Rashid's home office. The tone of the conversation made me pause involuntarily even before I consciously registered specific words. There was an edge to the voices that contrasted sharply with the warmth and celebration that had characterized the evening up to that point. I heard my name spoken, Lena Chan, pronounced in a context that clearly indicated I was being discussed rather than addressed. I stood in the hallway with my hand still on the bathroom doorknob, my instincts screaming that something was wrong even before my conscious mind processed what I was hearing. The rational part of my brain suggested that I should either announce my presence or simply return to the main gathering, that listening to a private conversation was inappropriate regardless of the language being used or the topic being discussed. But something deeper than rational thought kept me frozen in place, listening to words that would destroy every assumption I had made about my life for the past 3 years. Rashid's voice was distinctive and authoritative, the voice of someone accustomed to being the senior decision-maker in family matters. He was speaking in Lebanese Arabic, a dialect I had studied extensively, because my father believed that understanding regional variations in language provided cultural insight that transcended mere vocabulary. Rashid was saying that the estate settlement was proceeding exactly as they had planned, and that my father's attorneys were apparently accepting the partnership documentation at face value without conducting the kind of thorough investigation that would have revealed the actual terms they had implemented versus what had been presented to my father for signature. My hands went cold and my heart began racing even though I did not yet fully comprehend the implications of what I was hearing. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, making my body as small and unnoticeable as possible, holding my breath as if the people in the office might somehow sense my presence through walls and partially closed doors. Amira's voice joined the conversation, her tone practical and businesslike, completely different from the warm maternal energy she had been projecting all evening. She was saying that I remained appropriately isolated from my father's former business associates, that the strategy of positioning Marcus and the family as my primary support system during my father's illness had been extremely effective, and that I showed no signs of seeking independent legal or financial advice that might complicate their access to assets they were preparing to claim. The words landed like physical blows even though I still did not fully understand the scope of what was being revealed. My father's illness, my grief, Marcus's support through the most difficult period of my life, all of it was being discussed as strategic elements of some larger plan I had not known existed. I felt nausea rising in my throat but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to remain still and silent and to keep listening even though every word was causing pain that I knew would only intensify as I understood more. Nadia spoke next with a contempt in her voice that I had never heard during any of our previous interactions. She was saying that I was exactly the type of naive American woman who would never suspect that genuine affection could be entirely simulated for instrumental purposes. She described me as trusting and compliant, someone who had been raised by a single father without female guidance, and who therefore lacked the social intelligence that might have allowed me to recognize manipulation when it was happening. She laughed as she said this, a harsh sound that made clear she viewed me not as a person but as a mark who had been successfully deceived. I wanted to walk away but I could not move. I wanted to cover my ears but I forced myself to keep listening. Some part of me understood that whatever I was learning in this moment was information I desperately needed, even though it was destroying me to hear it. Some survival instinct I did not know I possessed was keeping me present and attentive, even as my internal world collapsed into chaos. Marcus's voice entered the conversation and hearing him speak about me in this context was somehow worse than hearing his mother or uncle or aunt. His voice was casual and detached, reporting information rather than expressing emotion. He was saying that I had signed documents he had presented as routine estate paperwork, but which actually granted him power of attorney over certain accounts that I had inherited from my father. He explained that I had shared detailed information about my father's intellectual property holdings without understanding their actual market value or their strategic importance. He noted that I continued to trust him completely despite what he described as small inconsistencies that a more suspicious person might have questioned. The tone he used when discussing me contained no affection whatsoever. I was a project he was managing, a task he was completing, an objective he was achieving. Every intimate moment we had shared, every time he had held me while I cried about losing my father, every conversation about our future together, all of it had been performance on his part. The person I thought I knew and loved did not exist and perhaps had never existed. The entire relationship had been constructed deliberately to gain access to assets my father had worked decades to accumulate and had intended for me to inherit. Rashid spoke again, his voice containing satisfaction that made my stomach turn. He said that the wedding needed to happen within the next 3 months before I had opportunity to consult with independent attorneys or financial advisors who might review the estate settlement and identify irregularities. He noted that my grief and my dependence on Marcus for emotional support were creating a window of opportunity that would not remain open indefinitely. He emphasized the importance of maintaining my isolation and managing my emotional state to keep me compliant and unsuspecting until the legal mechanisms were fully in place. The conversation continued with detailed discussion of specific assets and access strategies, of timelines and contingency plans, of what would happen to various holdings once they had legal authority to act on my behalf through the power of attorney documents I had unknowingly signed. They discussed my father's intellectual property portfolio with the kind of detailed knowledge that indicated they had been studying his assets carefully for much longer than I had realized. They mentioned specific software patents and real estate holdings that I had not known existed, revealing that they understood my inheritance better than I did myself. Amira raised a question about what would happen if I eventually discovered the deception, if something triggered my suspicion before they had secured full access to all assets. Her tone suggested this was a minor concern rather than a serious threat, but that prudent planning required considering various scenarios. Rashid responded that by the time I understood what had happened, the legal structures would be so complex and the documentation would be so thoroughly constructed that challenging their claims would require years of expensive litigation that I would likely be unable to afford or sustain emotionally. He said that most victims of this kind of long-term fraud simply accepted their losses because fighting seemed more costly than the potential recovery. Marcus added that my emotional attachment to him and to his family would make me hesitant to pursue legal action, even if I did suspect something was wrong, that I would try to find explanations that preserved the relationship rather than immediately assuming malicious intent. He said this with confidence that suggested he had successfully cultivated emotional dependence that would make me prioritize maintaining connection over protecting my own interests. The casual cruelty of this analysis, the assumption that my love and trust could be weaponized against me, created a fury that cut through the shock and grief I was experiencing. These people had not just stolen money or defrauded an estate. They had systematically destroyed my ability to trust other human beings. They had taken the worst period of my life and used it as an opportunity for exploitation. They had turned my grief into vulnerability they could leverage and my love into a liability that undermined my judgment. I heard movement in the office that suggested the conversation was concluding. Someone said that they should return to the main gathering before their absence was noticed and questioned. I realized I had perhaps seconds to move from the hallway before they emerged and discovered me standing there. I forced my frozen body into motion, walking quickly but quietly back toward the main areas of the house, my mind racing to construct some plausible reason for why I might have been in the hallway if anyone asked. I reached the living room just as several family members were emerging from the hallway behind me. I immediately joined a conversation that Marcus's sisters were having with cousins about summer vacation plans, inserting myself into their discussion with a comment about wanting to visit the San Juan Islands again. My voice sounded normal to my own ears despite the chaos screaming inside my skull. My face maintained an appropriate expression of pleasant interest, even though I felt like every cell in my body was vibrating with shock and rage. Marcus appeared beside me moments later, putting his arm around my waist in a gesture that would have seemed affectionate to any observer. He asked if I was feeling all right because I looked a bit pale. I told him I was just full from the enormous meal and perhaps tired from the long week at work. He kissed my temple in that casual, intimate way that couples develop over years together, and suggested we could leave soon if I was exhausted. I smiled and said there was no rush, that I wanted to stay for dessert and more conversation, that I was having a lovely evening with his family. The performance I was giving was convincing enough that Marcus did not question it. He relaxed visibly, assuming that my appearance of normalcy meant everything was fine, that I remained the compliant, trusting woman they had all been discussing in Arabic minutes earlier. He had no idea that I understood every word they had said. He had no idea that his entire conspiracy had just been revealed to someone who now understood the full scope of the deception, and who was already beginning to plan how to respond. Amira brought out dessert shortly after, presenting baklava that she had constructed with dozens of filo layers brushed with clarified butter, and filled with pistachios and walnuts, then soaked in honey syrup flavored with rose water and orange blossom. The sweetness should have been pleasant, but everything tasted like ash in my mouth. I ate small bites and complimented her baking while internally calculating what I needed to do, and how quickly I needed to act. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversation I participated in without retaining any content, of goodbyes and embraces that felt like violations now that I understood they were performance rather than genuine affection, of promises about future gatherings and wedding planning sessions that I knew I would never attend. Marcus drove me home while talking about how well the evening had gone, and how happy his family was about our upcoming marriage. I responded with appropriate sounds of agreement while staring out the window at the passing city lights, my mind already several steps ahead, planning my escape from the trap that had been constructed around me with such careful patience and thorough manipulation. When we arrived at my apartment, Marcus walked me to my door as he always did. He kissed me goodnight and said he loved me, and that he would call me tomorrow to discuss wedding vendor meetings we had scheduled for the following week. I told him I loved him too, the words tasting like poison in my mouth but necessary to maintain the facade until I had secured my position and gathered resources to fight back. I closed and locked my door behind me, and stood in my small apartment surrounded by furniture and possessions that suddenly felt like they belonged to a different person who had lived a different life. That person had been naive and trusting and had believed that love was real, and that people who claimed to care about you were being honest. That person no longer existed. She had been murdered in a hallway while listening to her fiancé and his family discuss her as an object to be acquired and exploited rather than as a human being worthy of basic respect and honesty. I sat on my couch in the darkness, not bothering to turn on lights, feeling grief and rage cycling through my body in waves that made it difficult to breathe properly. I had lost my father 14 months earlier, and that loss had been devastating enough. Now I was losing the relationship I had built with Marcus and the family system I thought I had been welcomed into and the future I had been planning and the version of myself who could trust other people. The magnitude of the betrayal was so complete that I could not process it all at once. My brain kept trying to find alternative explanations that would preserve some element of what I had believed, even though I knew with absolute certainty that every word I had heard had been true. I needed to act quickly and strategically. I needed to understand exactly what documents I had signed, and what legal authority I had inadvertently granted. I needed to secure assets before they could be claimed or transferred. I needed to find attorneys and financial advisors who could help me protect what my father had worked his entire life to build, and had intended for me to inherit. I needed to extract myself from this relationship without alerting Marcus or his family to what I had discovered, until I had established defensive positions that would prevent them from implementing whatever contingency plans they had developed for the scenario where I became aware of their fraud. But before I could do any of that, I needed to sit in the darkness of my apartment and feel the full weight of what had been done to me. I needed to acknowledge that the past 3 years of my life had been largely fiction, that the person I had planned to marry did not exist, that the love I thought we shared had been one-sided performance art. I needed to grieve for the loss of innocence and trust, for the death of the version of myself who could move through the world believing that people were generally decent and that affection meant what it appeared to mean. I sat there alone in the dark until the first light of dawn began filtering through my windows, feeling everything that needed to be felt, so that I could then set aside emotion and focus on practical strategy. By the time morning arrived, I had cried until I had no tears left and had moved through shock into something harder and clearer. I was done being the naive woman they had discussed with such contempt. I was done being the victim in their carefully orchestrated fraud. I was going to fight back with every resource I could marshal and every bit of intelligence I possessed. They had underestimated me catastrophically by assuming I could not understand Arabic. That single arrogant assumption would be their downfall and my salvation. The morning after the engagement dinner arrived with the kind of brilliant spring sunshine that felt cruelly inappropriate given the internal devastation I was experiencing. I had not slept at all, spending the entire night sitting on my couch alternating between researching legal strategies on my laptop and simply staring at the wall while my mind processed the implications of what I had discovered. By the time dawn broke, I had developed the outline of a strategy that would require extraordinary discipline and patience, but which offered the best chance of protecting my inheritance and exposing the fraud that had been perpetrated against my father and against me. The most critical element of my strategy was maintaining absolute normalcy in my interactions with Marcus and his family while I quietly gathered evidence and secured legal representation. They could not know that I understood Arabic or that I had overheard their conversation. Any change in my behavior or any indication that I suspected their intentions would trigger whatever contingency plans they had developed for managing a suspicious target. I needed them to continue believing I was the naive compliant woman they had been discussing with such contempt, at least until I had established defensive positions that would prevent them from accessing assets or implementing the fraud they had been planning. This meant I had to continue living with Marcus in the apartment we had been sharing for the past 8 months. I had to continue planning our wedding and attending family gatherings and responding to affection with apparent reciprocation. I had to sign no additional documents and make no financial moves that would alert them to heightened awareness, while also finding ways to review what I had already signed and to understand what authority I had inadvertently granted. The level of deception this required felt overwhelming, but I reminded myself that they had been deceiving me for 3 years with apparently effortless skill, so certainly I could manage deception for the few months it would take to build my case and secure my position. My first action that Sunday morning was to call my father's primary attorney, Michael Brennan, whose contact information I located in the files my father had left in his home office. Michael had handled various legal matters for my father over the years, including business contracts and estate planning. I reached his voicemail because it was Sunday morning and left a message saying that I needed to schedule an urgent consultation about estate settlement matters and some concerns I had about documents I had been asked to sign. I kept my tone measured and professional rather than panicked, not wanting to leave any record that might suggest emotional distress that could later be characterized as instability. Michael returned my call within 2 hours, which suggested he recognized the seriousness of my request despite my carefully controlled tone. We scheduled a meeting for Monday afternoon at his office in downtown Seattle. I told Marcus I had a vendor meeting for the wedding at that time, establishing a pattern of wedding-related appointments that would provide cover for the various legal and financial consultations I would need to conduct over the coming weeks. That Sunday I also began documenting everything I could remember about the conversation I had overheard at the engagement dinner. I wrote down every name that had been mentioned, every specific asset that had been discussed, every timeline reference, and every detail about their planning strategies. I documented this in a password-protected file on my laptop, using encryption software my father had taught me to use years earlier for protecting sensitive information. The act of writing everything down helped me process what I had heard, while also creating a record that might prove useful in eventual legal proceedings. I spent Sunday afternoon at my father's house, ostensibly to continue sorting through his belongings and addressing estate matters that I had been avoiding during the intense grief of the previous months. This provided legitimate reason to be there without Marcus, who had his own work projects to complete, and who did not question my need to spend time in the space where my father had lived. While at the house, I searched through my father's files looking for any documentation related to his partnership with Rashid, any notes he might have made about concerns or observations, and any indication that he had suspected the Khalil family's intentions before his death. What I found in my father's office both relieved and devastated me. Hidden in a file drawer beneath unrelated documents, I discovered a folder labeled with my name and marked private. Inside were notes my father had made during the final year of his life documenting suspicious behaviors he had observed, questions he had about the timing of certain interactions, and detailed analysis of financial arrangements that did not align with what had been discussed verbally. My father had suspected that something was wrong even though he apparently had not understood the full scope of the conspiracy. The notes indicated that my father had begun investigating the Khalil family's background approximately 14 months before his death. Around the same time, his cancer diagnosis had made clear that he had limited time remaining. He had discovered that Rashid had been involved in several previous business disputes that had been settled quietly, that the family had patterns of cultivating relationships with recently widowed business owners, and that their financial practices showed irregularities that suggested sophisticated understanding of how to exploit gaps in regulatory oversight and legal protections. My father had written in one note that he suspected Marcus's interest in me might not be coincidental, but that he had no definitive proof and feared that raising suspicions without evidence would damage our relationship during his final months when he wanted us to remain close. He wrote that he was working to restructure his estate in ways that would protect assets regardless of what happened after his death, that he was documenting everything he could, and that he hoped I would eventually discover the truth and would have resources to defend myself when that happened. Reading my father's words from beyond his death brought fresh grief crashing over me. He had known something was wrong and had worked during his final months while dealing with devastating illness to build protections around me. He had died unable to warn me directly but trying desperately to give me tools I would need for a fight he anticipated even if he could not predict its exact form. The love embedded in those notes was almost unbearable to witness. He had been protecting me even when he could no longer be present to stand beside me. I photographed every page of my father's notes using my phone, then returned the folder to its hiding place in case I needed to access the originals later. I also searched for and located the contracts related to the partnership with Rashid, reading through the legal language carefully to understand what terms had actually been agreed to versus what had been discussed in my presence. The documents were complex and filled with terminology I did not fully understand, but certain provisions stood out as potentially problematic, including revenue sharing arrangements that seemed heavily weighted toward Rashid's benefit and intellectual property clauses that appeared to grant broader rights than my father's verbal descriptions had suggested. When I returned to the apartment Marcus and I shared, he greeted me with casual affection and asked how the day at my father's house had been. I told him it was emotionally difficult but necessary, that I was making progress on sorting through possessions and paperwork, and that I appreciated his understanding about my need to handle some of this work alone. He kissed my forehead and said he understood grief took time, and that I should handle things at whatever pace felt manageable. His performance of supportive partner was so convincing that I had to remind myself of what I had heard him say about me in Arabic just 24 hours earlier. Monday morning I went to work at Greenbridge Architecture, and attempted to function normally despite having slept perhaps 3 hours over the past 2 nights. My colleagues noticed I looked tired and I attributed this to wedding planning stress and ongoing grief about my father. Patricia checked in with me privately to ask if I needed any accommodation or reduced workload, and I assured her I was managing adequately even though internally I felt like I was operating on emergency reserves that could not be sustained indefinitely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.